And you won't want to live without your precious mommy anyhow, take my word for it. Because your father's the sort of man who will have to have some wormhole to stick it in. Believe me. And if you're the only one available, you're the one who'll have to serve. I'll save you all that discomfort and unpleasantness, and you'll go to heaven. Think of that. Murdered souls always go to heaven. So we'll both be serving God this afternoon, Gary. Isn't that nice?
For many people, Stephen King is their first taste of horror written for an adult audience. But oftentimes, King readers stop reading him before they hit a true King gem. One of the biggest problems with Stephen King is that the only form he has truly mastered as an author is the short story. Now, I think many people are overly willing to call King a hack because his novels are long, meandering, and don't showcase his talents as an artist nearly as well as his short stories. But the reality of the situation is that when he truly tries in his strongest medium, he is just as capable of outputting real art as any literary fiction author. Hey, I'm Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden, and today I would love for you to join me in taking a look at the author who first got me into fiction, Stephen King. I would like this to be the first part in a playlist of short stories that can give you an idea of what makes a talented author's stories work. It will join my first video about Shirley Jackson's The Summer People in a playlist that I will be calling the Auteurs section, so that any viewer can hopefully get an idea of when horror writing crosses over into being horror literature. While King has many great short stories, my favorite that I've ever read is one that I've read for the first time recently, The Man in the Black Suit from the collection Everything's Eventual. It's funny because originally I was going to open this channel with a different Stephen King short story, The Boogeyman, but because I was so rusty from not recording in about a year, I ended up shelving that video for a later date. Instead of returning to that video now, I've kind of made the conscious decision to class up the joint. With me covering a lot of these pieces of internet fiction that are of dubious quality and me trying to engage in a bit of light criticism, I feel like it's going to become increasingly important to weave in examples of high-quality fiction for my audience. When I went back to the drawing board, I decided to look specifically at times that Stephen King had won awards for his fiction. The Man in the Black Suit has not just won an award, but specifically the O. Henry Award, which is not restricted to only genre fiction. This story specifically shows that King is able to compete with actual literary fiction when he isn't having his mass output fluffed up by publishers that care more about profits than art. In this story, King uses his gift for monstrous dialogue that he has trained during his time writing It. However, this time he does it in a story that won't make me at first terrified and later attracted to clowns. But before we get into the story, let me do my little spiel. I'm trying to move my following from Twitter and Spotify over to YouTube. Every subscription, comment, and like helps. So if you're interested in horror or a communist and conspiratorial lens for examining art, I'd love to have you as part of the Golden Order. I'm also looking for suggestions in the amateur fiction category. Think like your No Sleep and your creepypastas and SCPs from my lovely watchers. If you have any ideas, now is the perfect time to leave a suggestion in the comments before I fill up my slate with my own ideas. Also, if you've noticed, because it is now summer break, I am hopefully going to be recording about 2 videos a week. It's possible that you may see a video or 2 at night, and before I get my lighting really fixed up in my studio, because I'm used to recording podcasts, not video, the lighting might be a little off. You can see I'm a little blue, but if I were green, I would die, so you know how that is. Anyway, without further ado, I present you all The Man in the Black Suit. I'm now a very old man, and this is something that happened to me when I was very young, only 9 years old. It was 1914, the summer after my brother Dan died in the West Field, and not long before America got into the First World War. I've never told anybody about what happened at the fork in the stream that day, and I never will. I've decided to write it down, though, in this book, which I will leave on the table beside my bed. I can't write long because my hands shake so these days, and I have next to no strength. But I don't think it will take long. The opening paragraph does a masterful amount of front-loading. We know that we are going to have a story where we are faced with the devil from the opening paragraph because of the similarity between a fork in a stream and a fork at the crossroads. King has a propensity for Americana that puts him in a tradition of American artists with a variety of different sensibilities, from David Lynch to Norman Rockwell to Pete Seeger. The usage of the devil at a crossroads puts King within this tradition because that trope is rooted in early blues culture. Later, someone may find what I have written. That seems likely to me, as it is pretty much human nature to look at a bookmarked diary after its owner has passed along. So yes, my words will probably be read. A better question is whether anyone will believe them. Almost certainly not, but that doesn't matter. It's not belief that I'm interested in, but freedom. Writing can give that, I've found. For 20 years, I wrote a column called Long Ago and Far Away for the Castle Rock Call. And I know that sometimes it works that way. What you write down sometimes leaves you forever, like old photographs left in the bright sun, fading to nothing but white. I pray for that sort of release. A man in his 80s should be well past the terrors of childhood, but as my infirmities slowly creep up on me, like waves licking closer and closer to some indifferently built castle of sand, that terrible face grows clearer and clearer in my mind's eye. It glows like a dark star in the constellations of my childhood. What I might have done yesterday, who I might have seen here in my room at the nursing home, what I might have said to them or they to me, those things are gone, but the face of the man in the black suit grows ever clearer, ever closer, and I remember every word he said. I don't want to think of him, but I can't help it. And sometimes at night, my old heart beats so hard and so fast, I think it will tear itself right clear of my chest. So I uncap my fountain pen and force my trembling old hand to write this pointless anecdote in the diary of one of my great-grandchildren. I can't remember her name for sure, at least not right now, but I know it starts with an S, gave me last Christmas, and which I have never written in until now. Now I will write in it. I will write the story of how I met the man in the black suit on the bank of Castle Stream one afternoon in the summer of 1914. This story is an example of retrospective fiction. We're being told the story by a narrator who's looking back on his life. The reason that he's reflecting on the story now is because he feels that the next time he encounters the man in the black suit, he may not be able to stop him. The town of Motton was a different world in those days, more different than I could ever tell you. That was a world without airplanes droning overhead, a world without cars and trucks, a world where the skies were not cut into lanes and slices by overhead power lines. There was not a single paved road in the whole town. And the business district consisted of nothing but Corson's General Store, Thutt's Livery and Hardware, the Methodist Church at Christ's Corner, the school, the town hall, and half a mile down from there, Harry's Restaurant, which my mother called, with unfailing disdain, the Liquor House. This story is going to feel somewhat timeless. While it takes place in 1914, the level of rural development in 1914 really makes the story feel no different than if it had taken place in 1850 or 1680. It takes place in an era before FDR's mass electrification program, before rural areas had really been given the steps to equalize them with their more urban counterparts. Mostly, though, the difference was in how people lived, how apart they were. I'm not sure people born after the middle of the century could quite credit that, although they might say they could to be polite to old folks like me. There were no phones in Western Maine back then, for one thing. The first one wouldn't be installed for another 5 years, and by the time there was a phone in our house, I was 19 and going to college at the University of Maine in Orano. But this is only the roof of the thing. There was no doctor closer than Casco, and there were no more than a dozen houses in what you would call town. There were no neighborhoods. I'm not even sure we knew the word, although we had a verb neighboring that described church functions and barn dances. And open fields were the exception rather than the rule. Out of town, the houses were farms that stood far apart from each other, and from December until the middle of March, we mostly hunkered down in little pockets of stove warmth we called families. We hunkered and listened to the wind in the chimney, and hoped no one would get sick, or break a leg, or get a head full of bad ideas, like the farmer over in Castle Rock who had chopped up his wife and kids 3 winters before, and then said in court that the ghosts made him do it. In those days, before the Great War, most of Motton was woods and bog, dark long places full of moose and mosquitoes, snakes and secrets. In those days, there were ghosts everywhere. The thing I'm telling about happened on a Saturday. My father gave me a whole list of chores to do, including some that would have been Dan's if he'd still been alive. He was my only brother, and he died of a bee sting. A year had gone by, and still my mother wouldn't hear that. She said it was something else, had to have been, that no one had ever died of being stung by a bee. When Mama Sweet, the oldest lady in the Methodist Ladies' Aid, tried to tell her, at the church supper the previous winter this was, that the same thing had happened to her favorite uncle back in 73, that would be 1873 for my audience, to give you an idea of the dates here. My mother clapped her hands over her ears. Got up and walked out of the church basement. She'd never been back since, and nothing my father could say to her would change her mind. She claimed she was done with church, and that if she ever had to see Helen Robichaud again, that was Mama Sweet's real name, she would slap her eyes out. She wouldn't be able to help herself, she said. These two paragraphs help set up our premise for the story. The family that had been killed by their father over winter in Castle Rock, which the father blamed on the ghosts, introduces the idea that there is a supernatural threat lurking in these forests of Maine. The family not going to church after the death of Dan gives the devil a reason to target Gary later in the story. Gary being the name of our protagonist, which you don't know yet, but you're going to learn soon. That day, Dad wanted me to lug wood for the cook stove, weed the beans and the cucumbers, pitch hay out of the loft, get 2 jugs of water to put in the cold pantry, and scrape as much old paint off the cellar bulkhead as I could. Then he said I could go fishing if I didn't mind going by myself. He had to go over and see Bill Eversham about some cows. I said I sure didn't mind going by myself, and my dad smiled as if that didn't surprise him so very much. He'd given me a bamboo pole the week before, not because it was my birthday or anything, but just because he liked to give me things sometimes. And I was wild to try it in Castle Stream, which was by far the troutiest brook I'd ever fished. This is somewhat important because it establishes the dad as a good father, which is going to be important in the story later on. But don't go too far into the woods, he told me. Not beyond where the water splits. No, sir. Promise me. Yes, sir. I promise. Now promise your mother. We were standing on the back stoop. I had been bound for the spring house with the water jugs when my dad stopped me. Now he turned me around to face my mother, who was standing at the marble counter in a flood of strong morning sunshine falling through the double windows over the sink. There was a curl of hair lying across the side of her forehead and touching her eyebrow. You can see how well I remember it all. The bright light turned that little curl to filaments of gold and made me want to run to her and put my arms around her. In that instance, I saw her as a woman, saw her as my father must have seen her. She was wearing a house dress with little red roses all over it, I remember, and she was kneading bread. Candy Bill, our little black Scotty dog, was standing alertly beside her feet, looking up, waiting for anything that might drop. My mother was looking at me. I promise, I said. She smiled, but it was the kind of worried smile she always seemed to make since my father brought Dan back from the Westfield in his arms. My father had come sobbing and bare-chested. He'd taken off his shirt and draped it over Dan's face, which had swelled and turned color. "My boy!" he had been crying. "Oh, look at my boy! Jesus, look at my boy!" I remember that as if it were yesterday. It was the only time I'd ever heard my dad take the Savior's name in vain. The juxtaposition between the scene with his mother and the scene where he's remembering his father carrying his dead brother into the kitchen, I think really serves to state how traumatized Dan is, which is going to come into play in the story later when something fantastical happens to him and his family is unlikely to believe that it's true. "What do you promise, Gary?" she asked. "Promise not to go no further than where the stream forks, ma'am." "Any further." "Any." She gave me a patient look, saying nothing as her hands went on working in the dough, which now had a smooth, silky look. "I promise not to go any further than where the stream forks, ma'am." "Thank you, Gary," she said. "Thank you, Gary," she said, "and try to remember that grammar is for the world as well as for school." "Yes, ma'am." Candy Bill followed me as I did my chores, and sat between my feet as I bolted my lunch, looking up at me with the same attentiveness he had shown my mother while she was kneading her bread. But when I got my new bamboo pole and my old splintery creel, a creel is almost like a picnic basket where you can put your fish, and started out the dooryard, he stopped and only stood in the dust by an old roll of snow fence, watching. I called him, but he wouldn't come. He yapped a time or two as if telling me to come back, but that was all. So the dog already knows something is up in the woods. The dog is not the only person who is suspicious of the woods. You're going to find out later, too, that Gary and Dan's father is also suspicious of the things that lurk in the woods. "Stay then," I said, trying to sound as if I didn't care. I did, though, at least a little. Candy Bill always went fishing with me. Mother came to the door and looked out at me with her left hand held up to shade her eyes. I can see her that way still, and it's like looking at a photograph of someone who later became unhappy or died suddenly. "You mind your dad now, Gary?" "Yes, ma'am, I will." She waved. I waved too. Then I turned my back on her and walked away. The sun beat down on my neck, hard and hot, for the first quarter mile or so, but then I entered the woods where double shadow fell over the road, and it was cool and fur-smelling, and you could hear the wind hissing through the deep, needled groves. I walked with my pole on my shoulder the way boys did back then, holding my creel in my other hand, like a valise or a salesman's sample case. The stream flowed under a little wooden bridge, and the banks leading down to the water were steep and brushy. I streamed my way down carefully, holding on where I could and digging my heels in. The stream down out of summer and back into mid-spring, or so it felt. The cool rose gently off the water, and there was a green smell like moss. When I got to the edge of the water, I only stood there for a little while, breathing deep of that mossy smell and watching the dragonflies circle and the skitterbugs skate. Then, further down, I saw a trout leap at a butterfly, a good big brookie, maybe 14 inches long, and remembered I hadn't come here just to sightsee. I walked along the bank, following the current, and wet my line for the first time, with the bridge still in sight upstream. Something jerked the tip of the pole down once or twice and ate half my worm, but whatever it was too sly for my 9-year-old hands, or maybe just not hungry enough to be careless, so I quit that place. I stopped at 2 or 3 other places before I got to the place where Castle Stream forks, going southwest into Castle Rock and southeast into Cashwacamock Township, and one of them I caught the biggest trout I'd ever caught in my life, a beauty that measured 19 inches from tip to tail on the little ruler I kept in my creel. That was a monster of a brook trout, even for those days. If I had accepted this as a gift enough for one day and gone back, I would not be writing now. And this is going to turn out longer than I thought it would. I see that already. But I didn't. This single sentence in the graph serves 2 purposes in setting the scene. First, it introduces the idea that Gary has hubris, that he has something that is going to cause a downfall, by having him continue to stay after catching one of the biggest trout of his life. Second, it breaks the flow of the story, in the parenthetical, to remind us that we're being told a story by an old man. In doing so, we're reminded that Gary survives this encounter with the devil. It also reasserts the verisimilitude of the story, right before some of the more fantastical events begin to happen. King is pulling out all the stops in this short story, and you can really see why he won an O. Henry Award for this. Instead, I saw to my catch right then and there as my father had shown me, cleaning it, placing it on the dry grass on the bottom of the creel, then laying damp grass on top of it, and went on. I did not, at age 9, think that catching a 19-inch brook trout was particularly remarkable, although I do remember being amazed that my line had not broken when I, netless as well as artless, had hauled it out and swung it toward me in a clumsy tail-flapping arc. 10 minutes later, I came to the place where the stream split in those days. It is long gone now. There is a settlement of duplex homes where Castle Stream once went its course, and a district grammar school as well, and if there is a stream, it goes in darkness, dividing around a huge gray rock nearly the size of our outhouse. There was a pleasant flat space here, grassy and soft, overlooking what my dad and I called South Branch. I squatted on my heels, dropped my line into the water, and almost immediately snagged a fine rainbow trout. He wasn't the size of my brookie, only a foot or so, but a good fish just the same. I had it cleaned out before the gills had stopped flexing, stored it in my creel, and dropped my line back into the water. This time there was no immediate bite, so I leaned back, looking up at the blue stripe of sky I could see through the stream's course. Clouds floated by, west to east, and I tried to think of what they looked like. I saw a unicorn, then a rooster, then a dog that looked like Candy Bill. I was looking at the next one when I drowsed off. A lot of authors, when they are trying to go with a more literary take on genre fiction, try to give you something that allows for you to doubt the story, the fantastical elements of the story, that is, that the narrator is telling you. Poe had often done it with drugs, and King is doing it here with sleep. They all serve the same purpose. It allows for more skeptical readers to still feel invested in your story. Or maybe I slept. I don't know for sure. All I know is that a tug on my line so strong it almost pulled the bamboo pole out of my hand was what brought me back into the afternoon. I sat up, clutched the pole, and suddenly became aware that something was sitting on the tip of my nose. I crossed my eyes and saw a bee. My heart seemed to fall dead in my chest, and for a horrible second I was sure I was going to wet my pants. The tug on my line came again, stronger this time, but although I maintained my grip on the end of the pole so it wouldn't be pulled into the stream and perhaps carried away, I think I even had the presence of mind to snub the line with my finger, I made no effort to pull in my catch. All my horrified attention was fixed on the fat black and yellow thing that was using my nose as a rest stop. I slowly poked out my lower lip and blew upward. The bee ruffled a little but kept its place. I blew again and it ruffled again, but this time it also seemed to shift impatiently. And I didn't dare blow any more, for fear that it would lose its temper completely and give me a shot. It was too close for me to focus on what it was doing, but it was easy to imagine it ramming its stinger into one of my nostrils and shooting its poison up toward my eyes and my brain. A terrible idea came to me, that this was the very bee that had killed my brother. I knew it wasn't true, not only because honeybees probably didn't live longer than a single year, except maybe for the queens. About them I was not so sure. It couldn't be true, because honeybees died when they stung, and even at 9 I knew it. Their stingers were barbed, and when they tried to fly away after doing the deed, they tore themselves apart. Still, the idea stayed. This was a special bee, a devil bee, and it had come back to finish the other of Albion and Loretta's 2 boys. And here is something else. I had been stung by bees before, and although the stings had swelled more than is perhaps usual, I can't really say for sure, I had never died of them. That was only for my brother, a terrible trap that had been laid for him in this very making, a trap that I had somehow escaped. But as I crossed my eyes until they hurt in an effort to focus on the bee, logic did not exist. It was the bee that existed. Only that. The bee that had killed my brother. Killed him so cruelly that my father had slipped down the straps of his overalls so he could take off his shirt and cover Dan's swollen, engorged face. Even in the depth of his grief he had done that, because he didn't want his wife to see what had become of her firstborn. Now the bee had returned, and now it would kill me. I would die in convulsions on the bank, flopping just as a brookie flops after you take the hook out of its mouth. The scene of panic that prefaces Gary's encounter with the devil is King using his real estate on the page to serve 2 purposes for the reader again. The first is that it shows exactly how severe Gary's panic attacks are, because despite the fact that he's been stung by bees before and knows that bees don't live for more than a year and die after stinging, he believes that the bee that has killed Dan has returned to kill him. It shows us exactly how disordered Gary's thinking is. Likewise, Gary is going to seem panicked and irrational to his parents after his encounter with the devil, to the point that if there were any other child, they would likely know right away that something horrible had happened to him. However, because Gary has been having these kinds of panic attacks and disordered thinking, it becomes much easier to brush his feelings aside as the workings of an overactive imagination. As I sat there, trembling on the edge of panic, ready to bolt to my feet and then bolt anywhere, there came a report from behind me. It was as sharp and peremptory as a pistol shot, but I knew it wasn't a pistol shot. It was someone clapping his hands. One single clap. At that moment, the bee tumbled off my nose and fell into my lap. It lay there on my pants with its legs sticking up and its stinger a threatless black thread against the old scuffed brown of my corduroy. It was dead as a doornail. I saw that at once. At the same moment, the pole gave another tug, the hardest yet, and I almost lost it again. I grabbed it with both hands and gave it a big stupid yank that would have made my father clutch his head with both hands if he had been there to see. A rainbow trout, a good bit larger than either of the ones I had already caught, rose out of the water in a wet flash, spraying fine drops of water from its tail. It looked like one of those fishing pictures they used to put on the covers of men's magazines like True and Man's Adventure back in the 40s and 50s. At that moment, hauling in the big one was about the last thing on my mind, however, and when my line snapped and the fish fell back into the stream, I barely noticed. I looked over my shoulder to see who had clapped. A man was standing above me at the edge of the trees. His face was very long and pale. His black hair was combed tight against his skull and parted with rigorous care on the left side of his narrow head. He was very tall. He was wearing a black 3-piece suit, and I knew right away he was not a human being, because his eyes were the orangey red of flames in a wood stove. I don't mean just the irises, because he had no irises, and no pupils, and certainly no whites. His eyes were completely orange, an orange that shifted and flickered. And it's really too late not to say exactly what I mean, isn't it? He was on fire inside, and his eyes were like the little isinglass portholes you sometimes see in stove doors. Right away, we get a supernatural description of the devil, and so that we know that it is the devil and he is supernatural, but there are some details that are not supernatural but are still important. The biggest one of which I think is his hair. His hair is short black and in a left part, which gives him the exact hairstyle of Adolf Hitler, which I think gives him the kind of timeless quality that the mood of the story is going for, both in the characters that it presents and in its setting. My bladder let go, and the scuffed brown the dead bee was lying on went a darker brown. I was hardly aware of what had happened, and I couldn't take my eyes off the man standing on top of the bank and looking down at me. The man who had apparently walked out of 30 miles of trackless western Maine woods in a fine black suit and narrow shoes of gleaming leather. I could see the watch chain looped around his vest glittering in the summer sunshine. There was not so much as a single pine needle on him, and he was smiling at me.
Why, it's a Fisher boy!
He cried in a mellow, pleasing voice.
Imagine that! Are we well met, Fisher boy?
So, the fact that the devil visits Gary when he's fishing is likely intended to feel biblical. He even calls Gary Fisher Boy, which is a reference to Jesus' title of Fisher of Men. Protestant Christianity is a staple in Americana, along with blues kind of worries of the devil. And so both of those are kind of combining in what King's doing here. "Hello, sir," I said. The voice came out of me did not tremble, but it didn't sound like my voice either. It sounded older, like Dan's voice maybe, or my father's even. And all I could think of was that he would let me go if I pretended not to see what he was, if I pretended I didn't see that there were flames glowing and dancing where his eyes should have been.
I've saved you a nasty sting, perhaps.
And then to my horror, he came down to the bank to where I sat with a dead bee in my wet lap and a bamboo fishing pole in my nerveless hands. His slick-soled city shoes should have slipped on the low grassy weeds addressing the steep bank, but they didn't. Nor did they leave tracks, I saw. Where his feet had touched, or seemed to touch, there was not a single broken twig, crushed leaf, or trampled shoe shape. Even before he reached me, I recognized the aroma baking up from the skin under the suit, the smell of burned matches, the smell of sulfur. The man in the black suit was the devil. He had walked out of the deep woods between Motton and Kashwakamak, and now he was standing here beside me. From the corner of one eye, I could see a hand as pale as the hand of a store window dummy. The fingers were hideously long. He hunkered beside me on his hams, his knees popping just as the knees of any normal man might. But when he moved his hands so they dangled between his knees, I saw that each of these long fingers ended in not a fingernail, but a long yellow claw.
You didn't answer my question, Fisher boy,
he said in his mellow voice. It was now that I think of it, like the voice of one of those radio announcers on the big band shows years later, the ones that would sell Geritol and Seriton and Ovaltine and Dr. Grabow pipes.
Are we well met?
I was more afraid than I could ever write down, more afraid than I want to remember, but I do. It never crossed my mind to hope I was having a dream, although it might have, I suppose, if I had been older. But I was 9. I knew the truth when it squatted down beside me. I knew a hawk from a handsaw, as my father would have said. The man who had come down out of the woods on that Saturday afternoon in midsummer was the devil, and inside the empty holes of his eyes, his brains were burning. I've talked before about allowing your readers to make inferences with the information that you give them, but here I rather enjoy that Gary calls the man the devil directly in his narration. The reason I think it works here, it hasn't worked as well in other stories that I've talked about, like SCP-I, is that the evidence has been laid out so many times at this point that you're long to have expected to make the inference by now. He had burning coals for eyes, for God's sake. Like, we know what's going on here. Telling us that he's the devil here instead highlights the stakes of the story. It tells us what's going to happen to Gary if he doesn't get away.
Oh, do I smell something, he asked.
As if he hadn't heard me, although I knew he had.
Do I smell something wet?
He leaned toward me with his nose stuck out, like someone who means to smell a flower. And I noticed an awful thing. As the shadow of his head traveled over the bank, the grass beneath it turned yellow and died. He lowered his head toward my pants and sniffed, his glaring eyes half closed, as if he had inhaled some sublime aroma and wanted to concentrate on nothing but that. I think it's interesting that in this story, the devil comes off as almost outright pedophilic, based on this instance of him sniffing at Gary's peed pants and some of the stuff he says to him later in the story. I think it works so well because it's something that is just broadly recognized to be evil, but also King is coming fresh off of the heels of writing It. This was written in 1994, and It was written in 1986. And Pennywise acts very similarly to this incarnation of the devil. It gets to the point that I kind of wonder if King is responding to reader anticipation. I know that a lot of readers were reading It and kind of thinking that Pennywise was the devil, even though that does not turn out to be the case in the novel. Kind of have to wonder if this is a response to readers that wanted something more like a Hawthorne, which is what he was kind of going for here.
Oh, bad!
He cried.
Lovely bad!
And then he chanted,
Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade. I smell Gary's lemonade.
He threw himself on his back in the little flat place and laughed. I thought about running, but my legs seemed 2 counties away from my brain. I wasn't crying, though. I'd wet my pants, but I wasn't crying. I was too scared to cry. I suddenly knew that I was going to die, and probably painfully. But the worst of it was that might not be the worst of it. The worst might come later, after I was dead. This is what I was talking about earlier about stakes. He sat up suddenly, the smell of burnt matches fluffing out from his suit and making me feel gaggy in my throat. He looked at me solemnly from his narrow white face and burning eyes, but there was a sense of laughter about him too. There was always that sense of laughter about him.
Sad news, Fisher boy,
he said.
I've come with sad news.
I could only look at him, the black suit, the fine black shoes, the long white fingers that ended not in nails but in talons.
Your mother's dead.
No, I cried. I thought of her making bread, of the curl lying across her forehead and just touching her eyebrow, of her standing there in the strong morning sunlight, and the terror swept over me again, but not for myself this time. Then I thought of how she'd looked when I set off with my fishing pole, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hand shading her eyes, and how she had looked to me in that moment like a photograph of someone you expected to see again, but never did. No, you lie, I screamed. He smiled, the sadly patient smile of a man who has often been accused falsely.
I'm afraid not,
he said.
It was the same thing that happened to your brother, Gary. It was a bee.
No, that's not true, I said, and now I did begin to cry. She's old. She's 35. If a bee sting could kill her the way it did Danny, she would have died a long time ago. And you're a lying bastard. I had called the devil a lying bastard. I was aware of this. But the entire front of my mind was taken up by the enormity of what he'd said. My mother dead? He might as well have told me that the moon had fallen on Vermont. But I believed him. On some level, I believed him completely. As we always believe, on some level, the worst things our hearts can imagine.
I understand your grief, little Fisher boy, but that particular argument just doesn't hold water, I'm afraid.
He spoke in a tone of bogus comfort that was horrible, maddening, without remorse or pity.
A man could go his whole life without seeing a mockingbird, you know. But does that mean mockingbirds don't exist? Your mother...
A fish jumped below us. The man in the black suit frowned, then pointed a finger at it. The trout convulsed in the air, its body bending so strenuously that for a split second it appeared to be snapping at its own tail, and when it fell back into Castle's stream, it was floating lifelessly. It struck the big gray rock where the waters divided, spun around twice in the whirlpool eddy that formed there, and then floated away in the direction of Castle Rock. Meanwhile, the terrible stranger turned his burning eyes on me again, his thin lips pulled back from tiny rows of sharp teeth and a cannibal smile.
Your mother simply went through her whole life without being stung by a bee,
he said.
But then, less than an hour ago actually, one flew in through the kitchen window while she was taking the bread out of the oven and putting it on the counter to cool.
I raised my hands and clapped them over my ears. He pursed his lips as if to whistle, and blew it at me gently. It was only a little breath, but the stench was foul beyond belief. Clogged sewers, outhouses that have never known a single sprinkle of lime, dead chickens after a flood. One really strong trait of this writing that you can find in other pieces of horror is that by giving a description of other things, rot and shit and death, he's giving you a really good way to envision what Gary is experiencing without resorting to a description that's purely fantastical. You had the sulfur earlier, which is always associated with the devil, but these things are more mundane and yet still like fantastically horrific, giving the reader three things that almost every reader is going to have smelled before, and then grounding that in more mundane descriptions gives any reader a chance to relate to how scared Gary feels here. My hands fell away from the side of my face.
Good,
he said.
You need to hear this, Gary. You need to hear this, my little fisher boy. It was your mother who passed that fatal weakness onto your brother. You got some of it. But you also got a protection from your father that poor Dan somehow missed.
He pursed his lips again, only this time he made a cruelly comic little instead of blowing his nasty breath at me.
So, although I don't like to speak ill of the dead, it's almost a case of poetic justice, isn't it? After all, she killed your brother Dan as surely as if she had put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger.
No, I whispered. No, it isn't true.
I assure you it is,
he said.
The bee flew in the window and lit on her neck. She slapped at it before she even knew what she was doing. You were wiser than that, weren't you, Gary? And the bee stung her. She felt her throat start to close up at once. That's what happens, you know, to people who can't tolerate bee venom. Their throats close and they drown in the open air. That's why Dan's face was so swollen and purple. That's why your father covered it with his shirt.
I stared at him, now incapable of speech. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I didn't want to believe him, and knew from my church schooling that the devil is the father of lies, but I did believe him just the same.
She made the most wonderfully awful noises,
the man in the black suit said reflectively.
And she scratched her face quite badly, I'm afraid. Her eyes bulged out like a frog's eyes. She wept.
He paused, then added,
She wept as she died, isn't that sweet? And here's the most beautiful thing of all. After she was dead, and after she'd been lying on the floor for 15 minutes or so with no sound but the stove ticking, and with that little thread of a bee stinger still poking out of the side of her neck. So small, so small. Do you know what Candy Bill did? That little rascal licked away her tears, first on one side, and then on the other.
Gary describes the devil as being constantly amused with himself, even when talking about events that are horrific. And King's dialogue, I think, really shines in illustrating that. Again, I do want to emphasize, I think it's because he's coming right off the heels of writing Pennywise. These characters are written really similarly, but the devil here is a more serious character in literary fiction than an alien clown from outer space. And so the judges that gave him the award are going to take this devil character a lot more seriously than Pennywise, even though they're very similar. If anything, I think that's kind of a good slight against literary judges as far as they had gone. Like, I know I've talked negatively about Harold Bloom before, and the reason that I talk sometimes negatively about literary critics is I feel that oftentimes what they're really missing when they look at genre fiction essentially amounts to set dressing to make a work seem more intellectual. I do think this work is more intellectual than it, but if you're really focused on the quality of the writing and not the messaging, the quality of the writing is pretty similar. It's just that it is far more meandering, as I've said of King's novels in the past. I've talked about how in this story he's using the real estate of the page effectively by using paragraphs to do more than one thing at the same time. And unfortunately, King the novelist falls out of that habit, though King the short story writer is almost always in it. He looked out at the stream for a moment, his face sad and thoughtful. Then he turned back to me, and his expression of bereavement disappeared like a dream. His face was as slack and as avid as the face of a corpse that had died hungry. His eyes blazed. I could see his sharp little teeth between his pale lips.
I'm starving,
he said abruptly.
I'm going to kill you and eat your guts, little fisher boy. What do you think about that?
No, I tried to say. Please no. But no sound came out. He meant to do it, I saw. He really meant to do it.
I'm just so hungry,
he said, both petulant and teasing.
And you won't want to live without your precious mommy anyhow, take my word for it. Because your father's the sort of man who will have to have some wormhole to stick it in. Believe me, and if you're the only one available, you're the one who'll have to serve. I'll save you all that discomfort and unpleasantness, and you'll go to heaven. Think of that. Murdered souls always go to heaven. So we'll both be serving God this afternoon, Gary. Isn't that nice?
The devil, I mean, like, it goes without saying, but the devil's really gross here. I think it's really vile to take someone who's as good of a father for the time period as Gary's father and paint him as a potential child molester, but he's a devil, so we should kind of expect it. You can tell Gary's dad is a good father, both because of how he handles him later in the story, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but also just little things that have happened earlier, like the fact that he gets him a fishing pole for no reason. That's kind of uncharacteristic for a father to be that supportive at the turn of the 20th century. Early 1900s, dads were not supportive then. So it's very evil for the devil to frame the father this way, but he's the devil. What are you going to do? He reached for me again with long, pale hands, and without thinking what I was doing, I flipped over the top of my creel, pauled all the way down to the bottom, and brought out the monster brookie I'd caught earlier, the one I should have been satisfied with. It's kind of funny here to me, too. At the end of the story, Gary is going to say that there's nothing that a boy, a 9-year-old boy specifically, could do to attract the wrath of the devil. And while that's true, it does seem like he clearly identifies why it is that he's targeted. Greed is a very negative concept biblically, and he's describing himself as greedy. He also, though, thinks that because the devil's targeting him, he's going to go to hell, which I don't think is necessarily true. It's just he's attracted the wrath of the devil because of his greed. I held out the brookie to him blindly, my fingers in the red slit of its belly from which I had removed its insides as the man in the black suit had threatened to remove mine. The fish's glazed eyes stared dreamily at me, the gold ring around the black center reminding me of my mother's wedding ring. And in the moment, I saw her lying in her coffin with the sun shining off of the wedding band and knew it was true. She had been stung by a bee. She had drowned in the warm, bread-smelling kitchen air, and Candy Bill had licked her dying tears from her swollen cheeks.
Big fish,
the man in the black suit cried in a guttural, greedy voice.
Oh, big fish.
He snatched away from me and crammed it into a mouth that opened wider than any human mouth ever could. Many years later, when I was 65, I know it was 65 because that was the summer I retired from teaching, I went to the aquarium in Boston and finally saw a shark. The mouth of the man in the black suit was like that shark's mouth when it opened, only his gullet was blazing orange, the same color as his eyes, and I felt heat bake out of it and into my face, the way you feel a sudden wave of heat come pushing out of a fireplace when a dry piece of wood catches light. And I didn't imagine that heat either. I know I didn't. Because just before he slid the head of my 19-inch brook trout between his gaping jaws, I saw the scales along the sides of the fish rise up and begin to curl like bits of paper floating over an open incinerator. He slid the fish in like a man at a traveling show swallowing a sword. He didn't chew, and his blazing eyes bulged out as if in effort. The fish went in and went in. His throat bulged as it slid down his gullet. And now he began to cry tears of his own, except his tears were blood, scarlet and thick. I think it was the sight of those bloody tears that gave me my body back. I don't know why that should have been, but I think it was. I bolted to my feet like a jack released from its box, turned with my bamboo pole still in one hand, and fled up the bank, bending over and tearing through bundles of weeds out with my free hand in an effort to get up the slope more quickly. He made a strangled, furious noise, the sound of any man with his mouth too full, and I looked back just as I got to the top. He was coming after me, the back of his suit coat flapping, and his thin gold watch chain flashing and winking in the sun. The tail of the fish was still protruding from his mouth, and I could smell the rest of it roasting in the oven of his throat. He reached for me, groping with his talons, and I fled along the top of the bank. After 100 yards or so, I found my voice and went to screaming in fear, of course, but also screaming in grief for my beautiful dead mother. He was coming after me. I could hear snapping branches and whipping bushes, but I didn't look back again. I lowered my head, slitted my eyes against the bushes and low-hanging branches along the stream's bank, and ran as fast as I could. And at every step, I expected to feel his hands descending on my shoulders, pulling me back into a final burning hug. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. Some unknown length of time later, it couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 minutes, I suppose, but it seemed like forever, I saw the bridge through layerings of leaves and furs, still screaming, but breathlessly now, sounding like a tea kettle that had almost boiled dry. I reached this second steeper bank and charged up. Halfway to the top, I slipped to my knees, looked over my shoulder, and saw the man in the black suit almost at my heels. His white face pulled into a convulsion of fury and greed. His cheeks were spattered with his bloody tears, and his shark's mouth hung open like a hinge. The action sequences in this story are actually very similar to the action sequences in Abandoned by Disney, although it's, a bit more masterfully done here. King really only uses about one sentence in each of these graphs to describe the actual act of moving through the forest. In each of the other sentences, or two in each paragraph, he describes things like the sight of the forest, the anxiety of Gary, or the feeling of screaming after you've already shredded your vocal cords. I really wish that King wrote like this all the time. His writing is not always this strong, but I definitely think that these short stories are what younger writers have tended to learn from. You can read a lot of them in a very short period of time, and it's where his writing is the strongest. So when someone's writing reminds you of King, it almost always reminds you of the writing of King in his short stories, because that's what you want to emulate.
Fisher boy!
He snarled and started up the bank after me, grasping at my foot with one long hand. I tore free, turned and threw my fishing pole at him. He batted it down easily, but it tangled his feet up somehow, and he went to his knees. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and bolted up the top of the slope. I almost slipped at the very top, but managed to grab one of the support struts running beneath the bridge and save myself.
You can't get away, Fisher boy!
He sounded furious, but he also sounded as if he were laughing.
It takes more than a mouthful of trout to fill me up.
Leave me alone! I screamed back at him. I grabbed the bridge's railing and threw myself over it in a clumsy somersault, filling my hands with splinters and bumping my head so hard on the board when I came down that I saw stars. I rolled over on my belly and began crawling. I lurched to my feet just before I got to the end of the bridge, stumbled once, found my rhythm, and then began to run. I ran as only 9-year-old boys can run, which is like the wind. It felt as if my feet only touched the ground with every third or fourth stride, and for all I know, that may be true. I ran straight up the right-hand wheel rut in the road, ran until my temples pounded and my eyes pulsed in their sockets, ran until I had a hot stitch in my left side from the bottom of my ribs to my armpit, ran until I could taste blood and something like metal shavings in the back of my throat. When I couldn't run anymore, I stumbled to a stop and looked back over my shoulder, puffing and blowing like a wind-broken horse. I was convinced I would see him standing right there behind me in his natty black suit, the watch chain a glittering loop across his chest, and not a hair out of place. But he was gone. The road stretching back toward Castle Stream between the dark-massed pines and spruces were empty, and yet I sensed him somewhere near in those woods, watching me with his grass-fire eyes, smelling of burned matches and roasted fish. I turned and began walking as fast as I could, limping a little. I pulled muscles in both legs. When I got out of bed the next morning, I was so sore I could barely walk. I kept looking over my shoulder, needing again and again to verify that the road behind me was still empty. It was each time I looked, but those backward glances seemed to increase my fear rather than lessen it. The firs looked darker, messier, and I kept imagining what lay behind the trees that marched beside the road, long, tangled corridors of forest, leg-breaking deadfalls, ravines where anything might live. Until that Saturday in 1914, I had thought that bears were the worst things that the forest could hold. I love that after Gary manages to escape from the devil, the king makes the decision to reiterate the date. The conversation with the devil, it feels really timeless. It harkens back to a literary tradition where the story takes place in the 1600s, but it was written in the 1800s. So it feels very, very timeless. And so him reiterating the date is to remind us again, this is not that long ago. The time where devils were hiding in the forests of America, maybe it feels like it should be the 1600s. But this boy, Gary, he's seen them as recently as 1914, which it makes the thing that's lurking in the shadows feel closer to the reader. A mile or so further up the road, and just beyond the place where it came out of the wood and joined the Geegan Flat Road, I saw my father walking toward me and whistling the old oaken bucket. He was carrying his own rod, the one with the fancy spinning reel from Monkey Ward. In his other hand, he had his creel, the one with the ribbon my mother had woven through the handle back when Dan was still alive. Dedicated to Jesus, that ribbon said. This is a really important detail for a reader that's not going to be looking at interviews and stuff from King afterwards. You need to be able to tell that one piece of work is in direct conversation with another work without looking at what the author says. And so this section right here with the ribbons that come from the mother directly harkens to Young Goodman Brown, which is the work this work is supposed to be in conversation with, where Young Goodman Brown's wife, Faith, has a bunch of pink ribbons up in her hair before he goes out for the night walk where he meets the devil. So these two are really closely related. In fact, this is where I, as a reader, started to think that these two were connected to each other before I got to the end and got direct confirmation from the reader's notes or the author's notes that this was supposed to be similar to Young Goodman Brown. I had been walking, but when I saw him, I started to run again, screaming, "Dad, Dad, Dad," at the top of my lungs and staggering from side to side on my tired, sprung legs like a drunken sailor. The expression of surprise on his face when he recognized me might have been comical under other circumstances. He dropped his rod and creel into the road without so much as a downward glance at them and ran to me. It was the fastest I ever saw my dad run in his life. When we came together, it was a wonder the impact didn't knock us both senseless, and I struck my face on his belt buckle hard enough to start a little nosebleed. I didn't notice that until later, though. Right then, I only reached out my arms and clutched him as hard as I could. I held on and rubbed my hot face back and forth against his belly, covering his old blue work shirt with blood and tears and snot. "Gary, what is it? What happened? Are you all right?" "Ma's dead," I sobbed. "I met a man in the woods and he told me. Ma's dead. She got stung by a bee and it swallowed her all up, just like what happened to Dan, and she's dead. She's on the kitchen floor and Candy Bill licked the tears off her face, off her..." Face was the last word I had to say. But by then, my chest was itching so bad I couldn't get it out. My own tears were flowing again, and my dad's startled, frightened face blurred into 3 overlapping images. Trinity! It's the Trinity! He's back with God now. He's safe again. That's what the author's letting us know here. I began to howl, not like a little kid who skinned his knee, but like a dog that's seen something bad by moonlight. And my father pressed my head against his hard, flat stomach again. I slipped out from under his hand, though, and looked back over my shoulder. I wanted to make sure the man in the black suit wasn't coming. There was no sign of him. The road winding back into the woods was completely empty. I promised myself I would never go back down that road again. Not ever, no matter what. And I suppose now that God's greatest blessing to his creatures below is that they can't see the future. It might have broken my mind if I had known I would be going back down that road, and not 2 hours later. For that moment, though, I was only relieved to see we were still alone. Then I thought of my mother, my beautiful dead mother, and laid my face back against my father's stomach and bawled some more. In addition to the greed that Gary experiences that I mentioned as being one of the reasons that the devil targets him, there's another thing going on here too. If you may have noticed by now that almost every time Gary describes his mother, he's describing her as beautiful, and there's almost something edible here, but I don't really think that's what you're supposed to be grasping at. Instead, I think it's supposed to represent a loss of innocence. Him viewing his mother as a woman instead of just his mother is him kind of awakening to the way that adults see the world. And because of that, he's kind of in a bit of a, buzzword here, liminal space between adulthood and childhood at age 9. And that kind of makes it the perfect time for him to be targeted by the devil. "Gary, listen to me," he said a moment or two later. I went on bawling. He gave me a little longer to do that, then reached down and lifted my chin so he could look down into my face and I could look up into his. "Your mom's fine," he said. I could only look at him with tears streaming down my cheeks. I didn't believe him. I don't know who told you different. What kind of dirty dog would want to put a scare like that into a little boy? But I swear to God, your mother's fine. But he said, I don't care what he said. I got back from Eversham's earlier than I expected. He didn't want to sell any cows, it's all just talk. And decided I had time to catch up with you. I got my pole and my creel, and your mother made us a couple of jelly-fold leftovers. Her new bread, still warm. So she was fine half an hour ago, Gary. And there's nobody knows any different that's come from this direction. I guarantee you. Not in just half an hour's time. He looked over my shoulder. Who was this man? And where was he? I'm going to find him and thrash him within an inch of his life. I thought 1,000 things in just 2 seconds. That's what it seemed like anyway. But the last thing I thought was the most powerful. If my dad met up with the man in the black suit, I didn't think my dad would be the one to do the thrashing or the walking away. I kept remembering those long white fingers and the talons at the end of them. Gary? I don't know that I remember, I said. Were you where the stream splits? The big rock? I could never lie to my father when he asked a direct question, not to save his life or mine. Yes, but don't go down there. I seized his arm with both hands and tugged it hard. Please don't. He was a scary man. Inspiration struck me like an illuminating lightning bolt. I think he had a gun. He looked at me thoughtfully. Maybe there wasn't a man, he said, lifting his voice a little on the last word and turning into something that was almost but not quite a question. Maybe you fell asleep while you were fishing, son, and you had a bad dream, like the ones you had about Danny last winter. First things first, the name Danny does seem to be important to King because it comes up both here and in The Shining. I looked it up. He doesn't have a sibling or anything named Danny. That was my first thought. But the name is important enough to him that it is a reoccurring name. Also, the fact that Gary is traumatized gives his father a chance to rationalize his dream, because it does seem to me that the father believes there's something off about the experience, but because Gary has like this kind of PTSD, it gives Albion, which is his dad's name, a kind of an odd name, a chance to rationalize what's happening. I also like that in this story, there's no ambiguity that the devil is a liar. Gary even calls him a lying bastard. Both Gary and Goodman Brown are going to be haunted by their encounter with the devil, but for entirely different reasons. And these differences are key because it's what makes the difference between a work trying to expand on the ideas of another and a work simply being derivative of somebody else's work. I had a lot of dreams about Dan last winter. Dreams where I would open the door to our closet or to the dark, fruity interior of the cider shed and see him standing there and looking at me out of his purple, strangulated face. For many of these dreams, I had awakened screaming and awakened my parents as well. It's kind of similar to what he's doing right now as he's running from the stream bank. I had fallen asleep on the bank of the stream for a little while too, dozed off anyway, but I hadn't dreamed. And I was sure I had awakened just before the man in the black suit clapped the "be dead," sending it tumbling off my nose and into my lap. I hadn't dreamed him the way I had dreamed Dan. I was quite sure of that, although my meeting with him had already attained a dreamlike quality in my mind, as I suppose supernatural occurrences always must. But if my dad thought that the man only existed in my own head, that might be better. Better for him. It might have been, I guess, I said. Well, we ought to go back and find your rod and your creel. He actually started in that direction, and I had to tug frantically at his arm to stop him again and turn him back toward me. Later, I said, Please, Dad, I want to see Mother. I've got to see her with my own eyes. He thought that over, then nodded. Yes, I suppose you do. We'll go home first and get your rod and creel later. So we walked back to the farm together, my father with his fishpole propped on his shoulder, just like one of my friends, me carrying his creel, both of us eating folded over slices of my mother's bread smeared with blackcurrant jam. Did you catch anything? He asked as we came in sight of the barn. Yes, sir, I said. A rainbow, pretty good sized. And a brookie that was a lot bigger, I thought, but didn't say. That's all? Nothing else? After I caught it, I fell asleep. It was not really an answer, but not really a lie either. Lucky you didn't lose your pole. You didn't, did you, Gary? No, sir, I said very reluctantly. Lying about that would do no good, even if I'd been able to think up a whopper. Not if he was set on going back to get my creel anyway, and I could see by his face that he was. Up ahead, Candy Bill came racing out of the back door, barking his shrill bark and wagging his whole rear end back and forth the way Scotties do when they're excited. I couldn't wait any longer. I do love the description of Candy Bill. He's just like a Scotty that I used to own as a kid. Like, Scotties get really excited. They wag their whole body because they're kind of long. They're not as long as like a Dachshund or a Corgi, but he really nails it. I know King owns Corgis. This almost makes me feel like he's owned Scotties too in the past, though. I broke away from my father and ran to the house, still lugging his creel and still convinced, in my heart of hearts, that I was going to find my mother dead on the kitchen floor with her face swollen and purple, as Dan's face had been when my father carried him in from the west field, crying and calling the name of Jesus. But she was standing at the counter, just as well and fine as when I had left her, humming a song as she shelled peas into a bowl. She looked around at me, first in surprise, and then in fright, as she took in my wide eyes and pale cheeks. "Gary, what is it? What's the matter?" I didn't answer, only ran to her and covered her with kisses. At some point, my father came in and said, "Don't worry, Lo, he's all right. He's had one of his bad dreams down there by the brook." "Pray God it's the last of them," she said, and hugged me tighter while Candy Bill danced around our feet, barking his shrill bark. If this was where the story ended, it would be a pretty idyllic end to a story. Yet, it's a horror story, so we know that there's going to be more. Plus, I'll be in once to get the krill back.
When I went back,
You don't have to come with me if you don't want to, Gary, my father said, although he'd already made it clear that he thought I should. That I should go back and I should face my fear, as I suppose folks would say nowadays. That's very well for fearful things that are make-believe, but 2 hours hadn't done much to change my conviction that the man in the black suit had been real. I wouldn't be able to convince my father of that, though. I don't think there was a 9-year-old who ever lived who would have been able to convince his father he'd seen the devil walking out of the woods in a black suit. "I'll come," I said. I had come out of the house to join him before he left, mustering all my courage to get my feet moving, and now we were standing by the chopping block in the side yard not far from the woodpile. "What you got behind your back?" he asked. I brought it out slowly. I would go with him, and I would hope the man in the black suit with the arrow-straight part down the left side of his head was gone. But if he wasn't, I wanted to be prepared. As prepared as I could be, anyway. I had the family Bible in the hand I had brought out from behind my back. I'd set out just to bring my New Testament, which I had won for memorizing the most Psalms in the Thursday night youth fellowship competition. I managed 8, although most of them, except the 23rd, had floated out of my mind in a week's time. But the little red testament didn't seem like enough when you were maybe going to face the devil himself, not even when the words of Jesus were marked out in red ink. My father looked at the old Bible, swollen with family documents and pictures, and I thought he'd tell me to put it back, but he didn't. A look of mixed grief and sympathy crossed his face, and he nodded. "All right," he said. "Does your mother know you took that?" "No, sir." He nodded again. "Then we'll hope she doesn't spot it gone before we get back. Come on, and don't drop it." This is really interesting to me because this is confirmation to me that Gary's father does think that something beyond the explanation of Gary having a night terror happened to him in the woods. Him being willing to bring this family heirloom with all of these pictures, I'm assuming even pictures of his dead brother, along with them, shows that he feels like maybe needs some kind of protection as well. On top of that, it's not really mentioned anywhere in the story, but after Gary comes home, he's pissed and shit himself. And while pissing yourself, like that's pretty normal during a panic attack, shitting yourself a lot less so. And so I do think that he probably thought something was up. Half an hour or so later, the two of us stood on the bank at the place where Castle Stream forked, and at the flat place where I'd had my encounter with the man with the red-orange eyes. I had my bamboo rod in my hand. I picked it up below the bridge, and my creel lay down below on the flat place. Its wicker top was flipped back. We stood looking down, my father and I, for a long time, and neither of us said anything. "Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade. I smell Gary's lemonade." That had been his unpleasant little poem. And once he had recited it, he had thrown himself on his back, laughing like a child who had just discovered he had enough courage to say bathroom words like shit or piss. The flat place down there was as green and lush as any place in Maine that the sun can get to in early July, except where the stranger had lain. There, the grass was dead and yellow in the shape of a man. I was holding our lumpy old family Bible straight out in front of me with both thumbs pressing so hard on the cover that they were white. It was the way Mama Sweet's husband Norval held a willow fork when he was trying to douse somebody a well. "Stay here," my father said at last, and skidded sideways down the bank, digging his shoes into the rich soft soil and holding his arms out for balance. I stood where I was, holding the Bible stiffly out at the ends of my arms, my heart thumping. I don't know if I had a sense of being watched that time or not. I was too scared to have a sense of anything, except for a sense of wanting to be far away from that place in those woods. My dad bent down, sniffed at where the grass was dead, and grimaced. I knew what he was smelling, something like burnt matches. Then he grabbed my creel and came back onto the bank, hurrying. He snagged one fast look over his shoulder to make sure that there was nothing coming along behind. Nothing was. When he handed me the creel, the lid was still hanging back on its cunning little leather hinges. I looked inside, and saw nothing but 2 handfuls of grass. Thought you said you caught a rainbow, my father said. Maybe you dreamed that too. Something in his voice stung me. No, sir, I said. I caught one. Well, it sure as hell didn't flop out, not if it was gutted and cleaned. And you wouldn't put a catch in your fisher box without doing that, would you, Gary? I taught you better than that. Yes, sir, you did, but... So if you didn't dream catching it, and if it was dead in the box, something must have come along and eaten it, my father said. And then he grabbed another quick glance over his shoulder, eyes wide, as if he had heard something move in the woods. I wasn't exactly surprised to see drops of sweat standing out on his forehead like big clear jewels. Come on, he said. Let's get the hell out of here. His father gives an explanation that an animal could have come by and eaten it, but based on the way his dad's sweating and the fact that he allows him to bring the Bible behind, and even the fact that Gary shit himself when he was scared, all of those things combine to make the father suspicious as well, which I think is a really cool detail. It shows that while Gary thinks that there's the possibility that moving on, he might have thought it was all in his head, I think this cements it. Because of this, now he knows that what he saw was real. I was for that, and we went back along the bank of the bridge, walking quick without speaking. When we got there, my dad dropped to one knee and examined the place we'd found my rod. There was another patch of dead grass there, and the lady's slipper was all brown and curled in on itself, as if a blast of heat had charred it. Lady's slipper is like a flower, wildflower. I looked at my empty creel again. He must have gone back and eaten my other fish too, I said. My father looked up at me. Other fish? Yes, sir, I didn't tell you, but I caught a brookie too. A big one. He was awful hungry, that fellow. I wanted to say more, and the words trembled just behind my lips, but in the end, I didn't. We climbed up to the bridge and helped each other up over the railing. My father took my creel and looked into it, then went to the railing and threw it over. I came up beside him in time to see it splash down and float away like a boat, riding lower and lower in the stream as the water poured in between the wicker weavings. It smelled bad, my father said. But he didn't look at me when he said it, and his voice sounded oddly defensive. It was the only time I ever heard him speak just that way. Yes, sir. We'll tell your mother we couldn't find it, if she asks. If she doesn't ask, we won't tell her anything. No, sir, we won't. And she didn't, and we didn't, and that's the way it was. That is a really good way to end the story before the Lament of the Old Man version of Gary here at the very end. That day in the woods is 80 years gone, and for many of the years in between, I have never even thought of it, not awake at least. Like any other man or woman who ever lived, I can't say about my dreams, not for sure. But now I'm old, and I dream awake, it seems. My infirmities have crept up like waves that will soon take a child's abandoned sandcastle. My memories have also crept up, making me, like of some old rhyme that went, in part, just leave them alone and they'll come home, wagging their tails behind them. I remember meals I ate, games I played, girls I kissed in the school cloakroom when we played post office, boys I chummed with, the first drink I ever took, the first cigarette I ever smoked, corn shuck behind Dickie Hamner's pig shed, and I threw up. Yet of all the memories, the one of the man in the black is the strongest and glows with its own spectral haunted light. He was real. He was the devil. And that day, I was either his errand or his luck. I feel more and more strongly that escaping him was my luck. Just luck. And not the intercession of the God I have worshipped and sung hymns to all my life. As I lie here in my nursing home room and in the ruined sandcastle that is my body, I tell myself that I need not fear the devil, that I have lived a good, kindly life, and I need not fear the devil. Sometimes I remind myself that it was I, not my father, who finally coaxed my mother back to church later on that summer. In the dark, however, these thoughts have no power to ease or comfort. In the dark comes a voice that whispers that 9-year-old fisher boy I was had done nothing for which he might legitimately fear the devil either, and yet the devil came to him. And in the dark, I sometimes hear the voice drop even lower into ranges that are inhuman. Pigs, fish, it whispers in tones of hushed greed, and all the truths of the moral world fall to ruin before its hunger. Big fish. The devil came to me once, long ago. Suppose he were to come again now. I can't even get to the bathroom and back without my walker. I have no fine brook trout with which to propitiate him either, even for a moment or two. I am old, and my creel is empty. Suppose he were to come back and find me so, and suppose he is still hungry. I need like a sting or something to play at the end of the story. I've noticed like there are parts of the Creepcast podcast that I can take or leave, but I really love that they have like a little stinger for the end. I got to talk to some music folks for that. So that was The Man in the Black Suit. Before I go on to some of my broader notes on the overall story, which I always do, a minute or two of that at the end, I do have a little bit about the ending specifically. In a typical version of this story, the greed that the boy shows at the lake would be the reasoning behind why he was targeted by the devil, but this is never mentioned in the story really at all. Well, I don't think wanting to catch 5 or 6 brook trouts at a stream in one afternoon is worthy of attracting the wrath of the devil. It's certainly something that you would see in other parables like this. In addition, he sets up camp right at the end of where he was told to stay by his parents, and while technically he's honoring the wishes of his mother and father, I think that's worth mentioning because of the way that he talks about his mom as well as seeing her as a woman and how she's attractive. There's something a little off about that. Ultimately, does the boy do anything that is worse than when Lot's wife looks back at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and turns into a pillar of salt? No, but she shouldn't have turned into a pillar of salt, so him being attacked by the devil isn't really out of touch with an Old Testament understanding of God. Why it was able to win the awards it did while competing against literary fiction? The fact that the story is in direct conversation with the most famous horror story to make it out of 19th century New England really helps King demonstrate a mastery over the short story. Furthermore, King gives his story a very different reason for why his protagonist is haunted by the events of the story, which I think helps keeping it from feeling derivative of Young Goodman Brown. In Young Goodman Brown, Brown is haunted by his conversation with the devil because of his piety. It's how religious he is. It's revealed to him that the other people in his small Christian town are cavorting with the devil, and so they are less pious than he envisions himself. Worse still, his own family had engaged in pacts with the devil without being tricked when engaging in misogynistic witch trials or the massacring of Native Americans by burning them alive in their villages. The ultimate reveal of the story happens when he believes he overhears his very wife participating in a black mass in the woods. Ultimately, Young Goodman Brown is an allegorical tale. Brown's wife in the story is named Faith, and when he loses his trust in his wife, he's also losing his faith in God. Brown is a direct contrast with Gary. If anything, his faith becomes even stronger after his encounter with the devil, even convincing his mother to begin going back to church. However, his faith in God isn't any comfort to him. In this story, the devil doesn't represent a crisis of faith, but rather a personification of the evils that can await even someone as innocent as a child. There's a reason that the devil comes across as not much different than a serial killer who targets children. The threats Gary are visited with are some of the most evil acts that are perpetrated against children. The lesson in the novel is almost like the biblical verse in Peter, but made literal. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walketh about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. That's it for me on this one, folks. I'm hoping this story helps give you a better measuring stick for critiquing some of the short stories that I'll be looking at on this channel. I'll see you in the next one, and stay golden out there, folks.